He confessed to 93 murders. The FBI said those confessions were credible, making him the most prolific serial killer in American history. He was 79 years old. He was in prison. He had nothing left to lose. And yet, a detective walked into that room, sat down across from him, and got him to talk. Not because he threatened him, not because he broke him down, because he lied, carefully, strategically, and in a way that a predator with a photographic memory, who had outsmarted law enforcement for 5 decades, never saw coming. This is the story of how Texas Ranger James Holland sat across from Samuel Little and won. Before we get into the room, you need to understand who James Holland was walking in to face. Samuel Little was not what most people picture when they think of a serial killer. He wasn't the smooth, articulate type. He wasn't quiet or withdrawn. He was loud, aggressive, and immediately threatening to anyone in authority. He had spent most of his adult life cycling in and out of prison. Larceny, assault, drug offenses. He traveled constantly, never staying in one place long enough for anyone to connect the dots. And that was the point. His victims were almost exclusively women from vulnerable communities. Women whose disappearances, investigators have since admitted with shame, were not always thoroughly investigated at the time. By the time the FBI finally connected him to a series of murders in 2012, Little was in his 70s, in poor health, already incarcerated in California on drug charges. He was arrested. He was convicted of 3 murders. And then, the FBI had a hunch there were more, a lot more. They needed someone to go into that room. They called James Holland. James Holland was a Texas Ranger, and he had a reputation. Not for being aggressive, not for being loud, for being patient. Holland had spent years developing a method for interviewing the kind of people most detectives give up on. Career criminals, manipulators, people who had been through the system so many times they knew every move law enforcement was likely to make. His approach had one core principle: never let the subject feel like they're being interrogated. Holland understood something about Samuel Little specifically that would define every conversation they had. Little was a narcissist with a photographic memory. He remembered details about his victims, what they wore, what they said, what the light looked like, decades later. That memory was going to be the key. But first, Holland had to get through the door. The first time Holland walked into that room, Little was not happy to see him. That's putting it mildly. He'd get information from you, then send you packing, Holland later recalled, overwhelming you with anger and threatening tones. Little immediately tried to establish dominance. He described, in graphic, deliberate detail, exactly how he had killed a woman while locking eyes with Holland the entire time. It was a test. Most detectives would have reacted, shown disgust, anger, discomfort, something. And the moment they did, Little would have owned them. He would have known exactly how to handle them for every conversation that followed. Holland didn't flinch. He sat there. He listened. He kept his face completely neutral. And when Little finished, Holland simply continued the conversation. That was the first move in a chess game that would last more than 700 hours. Here's where it gets interesting. And this is the part most true crime coverage gets wrong. When we talk about a detective lying to a suspect, people imagine something clumsy, planting fake evidence, making wild claims, getting caught. What Holland did was far more precise than that. He understood that Samuel Little's greatest vulnerability wasn't guilt. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't fear of consequences. He was already in prison for life. His vulnerability was his ego and his memory. Little took pride in remembering every detail of every killing. He had actually drawn portraits of his victims from memory, detailed enough that investigators used them to identify women who had been unidentified for decades. So Holland used that. Holland would enter sessions with deliberately incomplete information, sometimes subtly wrong information about a case, not wild fabrications, just enough of a gap that Little's pride in his own memory couldn't resist filling it. This is the sophisticated part. Holland wasn't bluffing with fake evidence. He was constructing a psychological environment where Little felt he was the one with power, the one teaching the detective something, while systematically giving up information he had held for 5 decades. Holland was also rigidly disciplined about one thing. He never once tried to appeal to Little's conscience. If you step over that boundary, Holland explained later, you can never go back into the room with them. Remorse-based interrogation assumes the subject feels something about their crimes. Samuel Little felt nothing. Pushing on that would have instantly signaled to Little that Holland didn't understand him. And if the detective doesn't understand you, why talk to him? Over the following years, Holland returned to that room again and again. More than 700 hours of conversation. Little confessed to 93 murders. The FBI confirmed more than 60 of them, with details only the real perpetrator could have known. Cold cases dating back to the 1970s began closing. Women who had been unidentified for decades finally had names again. The confessions happened because Holland never once treated the interrogation like a confrontation. He didn't come in with a list of charges to run through. He came in with curiosity, with patience. He let Little guide the conversation, while quietly, invisibly steering it toward the details investigators needed. When Little tried to mislead him, Holland didn't confront him angrily. He'd laugh, calmly, and say, "Come on, I know what you did. What are you doing here?" That response communicated something very specific to Little. This detective actually knows the case. He can't be fooled, but he's not threatened by me either. To someone like Samuel Little, that combination, competence without aggression, was the only thing that kept him in the room. The Samuel Little case is studied now by investigators, by behavioral scientists, by people who train interrogators, because it broke nearly every assumption about how you're supposed to handle someone like this. The Reed technique, the dominant interrogation method used by American law enforcement for decades, is built around pressure, confrontation, making the subject feel the weight of the evidence against them. Against a vulnerable suspect that sometimes works, against Samuel Little, it would have produced nothing. A smart, experienced criminal who had outmaneuvered law enforcement for 50 years doesn't crack under pressure. He reads it, adapts to it, and uses it against you. What Holland understood, and what the research increasingly supports, is that the most effective interrogations don't look like interrogations at all. They look like conversations. The detective across from you isn't your enemy. He's interested in what you have to say. He seems to genuinely want to understand. And somewhere in that feeling, a man who had killed 93 people and never told anyone started talking. Samuel Little died in prison in December 2020 at the age of 80. There are still cases connected to his confessions that remain open. Victims who haven't been identified, families who don't yet have answers. The FBI case files, including the portraits he drew from memory, are publicly available. The link is in the description. James Holland never wrote a book about what happened in that room. He gave one interview. He said the work speaks for itself. 700 hours, 93 confessions, one conversation at a time. File closed.